Today we're going to be continuing 4-7 inverse of radicals. Now you should be watching this video after you have gone through 4-7 day 1 or part 1 and after you have done some practice with me in class. So we should have covered all of this in class, but in case you still have questions or would like to hear it one more time, this is the back page, or you were absent for some reason. So some of you were asking me, okay, so the inverse of a quadratic function is an inverse function, but we all know that an inverse function either looks like a shooting star, this is what we talked about before, or it's going to be the reflection of a shooting star, right? Now look at this. What happens if you combine those two? What are you going to get? You're going to get a parabola that is on the side just like this one. So basically, when you are finding the inverse of a quadratic function, you end up with two square root functions. One is going to be positive, which is going to be this part of it, which is the shooting star, and you're going to end up with the negative part of it, which is going to be the reflection of the shooting star, like we talked before. And if you combine those together, you get a sideways parabola. Make sense? Now let's try to do this on the side. So let me cancel this. Okay, so y equals 2x plus 4 squared. Now since this is a quadratic function, what is the domain? Negative infinity and infinity. Now what about the range? Now if you'd like to graph this to be able to see it more, let's do that. So y equals, I'm gonna clear this and I'm gonna also clear this. And over here I'm gonna enter, what's the parentheses, 2x plus 4, and then I'm gonna square this and I'm gonna graph it. So as you can see, it's gonna go from this point all the way up to infinity. So what is this when it comes to y? This is 0, so 0 up to infinity. That would be your range, 0 up to infinity. And another way you can think of it is that here there's nothing added, so it's a 0, so that's why it's a 0 up to infinity. So the range is from negative infinity to infinity, and the domain is from negative infinity to infinity, and the range is from the x-axis above, so it's from the 0 all the way to plus infinity. That's the range, which is the y. Now to find the inverse, let's make some room. Let's rewrite the equation. So we have y equals to 2x plus 4 squared. To find the inverse, the first thing you should do is switch the x and the y. Perfect. Then you need to get rid of the square. You need to find y, you need to isolate y, and you do that by square rooting both sides. Now, every time you square root something, it's going to get plus or minus. And every time you square root and there's a square on the inside, they cancel each other. So you are going to be left with, I'm going to continue over here to give myself some room. I'm going to be left with plus or minus square root of x, which is equal to 2y plus 4. See how the radical dropped because you squared it, and because you squared this, it became plus or minus. Now, in order to do that, you have to subtract a 4 from here and subtract a 4 from here. So it will be plus or minus square root of x minus 4. So as you can see, the negative 4 is next to the radical x. It's not inside the radical. Equals to 2y. You don't need to fix it, okay? And then to get the y, you can divide by 2. So you get y is equal to plus or minus square root of x minus 4 over all of it over 2. So that is it. Now if you need to watch this again, go ahead. Now remember, the domain and range for the inverse is going to switch. So you look at the domain and range of your graph and you try to switch it. Let me move this so you can see. So the domain of the main function is negative infinity to infinity, so the range of the inverse is going to be negative infinity to infinity. Now the range of the main function is 0 to infinity, So domain is going to be 0, infinity. As you can see, they switched. Okay. Now, how can I sketch this? Now, in order to sketch this, remember on the calculator, you would put the plus or minus. You cannot put this, so you put plus of square root of x minus 4 over 2. And then on the other one, you would put negative square x minus 4 over 2. Now, if you're not allowed to use a calculator in my pre-AP, how can you sketch this? Now, let me make this smaller so I can compare the main function to the new function. So if I'm gonna graph this, the main one, it's gonna be something like this, just like we saw on the calculator. Now the sketch is gonna be just sideways. For some reason it's not being airplayed anymore. Give me a minute to airplay my iPad again. Okay, there you go. So as you can see, it should be sideways. So let's try to see how it looks. So I'm gonna clear this. On 1 I'm gonna put plus square root of x minus 4 over 2. So remember how you can do that to put a fraction? What do? You would put alpha, and then you press the y. It would give you an option, so you need option number 1, which is a fraction. So you press enter, and then you can enter the fraction that you have. So it's going to be square root of x, and then over minus 4, and on the down you have to put a 2, so that would be the first one. And on the second one, again, what do? Alpha, and then y equals, you would get an option to get the fraction, so you need the first one, and you press enter. The second one is going to be negative square root of x, always over to stop the radical, minus 4, and then bottom of the fraction is going to be 2. You see that? Now once you graph this, it's also going to be a sideways parabola. Remember, the upper one, which is the shooting star, is the positive radical, and the lower one is going to be the negative radical. Now, is this inverse a function? Now, it's 2 parts, but basically, even though it's 2 parts, you have to think of it as 1. So if you do the vertical line test, it's going to cut this function, or this graph. It's not a function, so you're going to cut this graph into 2 points. That's why it's not a function. So no, it's not a function. So for something like this, to be able to graph it, I will allow you to use a calculator so you can see it. So this is how you would find whether it's an inverse or not. Now I think we're ready to move on to the other part. So now, how can you find the domain of a radical function? First of all, you have to think of the end point. Now the end point is the opposite, which is negative 4, and then whatever is being added or subtracted on the outside, there's nothing, so it's 0. The domain is going to be from negative 4 all the way to plus infinity, since this is a positive radical, and the range is going to be from the y, which is a 0, up to infinity. There you go. Now again, the domain and range has to shift to give you the inverse domain and inverse range. Now since we know that by now, we can directly put it, so 0 infinity is going to be the domain, and negative 4 infinity is going to be my range. Now let's work on finding the inverse. Let me write now the question. So y is equal to square root of x plus 4. Now every time you want to find the inverse, you would just switch the x and the y. So x is equal to square root of y plus 4. Now how can you get rid of the radical? You get rid of the radical by squaring both sides. Now this is going to be x squared. The square and the square root will cancel out, so you're going to only be left with the y plus 4. See? It's simple. Just take it step at a time. Then you subtract a 4. Then you will get that x squared minus 4 is equal to y. Remember, this is an inverse, so put a negative 1 on top of the y to show that this is an inverse. Now, how do we graph this? Now let's graph the radical function and we go from there. Now what is the endpoint? Negative 4, 0. So 1, 2, 3, 4. This is it. And then since it's both going to plus infinity, it's going to go to the right this way. So as you can see, it's a shooting star. Now if you want to draw the inverse of that, you have to look at the domain over here. So 0, negative 4. So the starting point for this one is going to be 0. You get it from the domain, 0. And the second one, or the y, is going to be the negative 4 because this is the range. So 0, negative 4. I'm going to use the blue. So 0, negative 4 is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Now since both of them are plus infinity, so it means it's going to go up. So that would be the inverse. So I know this can be a little bit complicated, so you may need to hear this again. Now let's talk about it. We will review this in the second example. Now they're asking me, is the inverse a function? Now in order to know that, so basically they're asking about the blue part. So draw a vertical line. As you can see, the vertical line will always cut it in only one point. So yes, the inverse of a radical function is going to be a function, as you can see, because the line cut it in only one point. So ask yourself, what is the inverse of a radical? Let's look at it. What does it look like? It looks like a quadratic. When you draw it, because it's like from 0 to infinity, it's not usually the domain of a quadratic is from negative infinity to infinity. So basically it would look like a parabola this way. But since they're only taking part of the domain, you only draw part of the parabola. You don't draw the other part. This is why it's a function. Now I know it can get complicated, so let's move on to this. Let's see. Hopefully with another example you will understand it more, and we will have more examples too. Now y equals to square root of x minus 2 plus 3. Now the endpoint for this one is going to be 2, 3. So the domain, since this is positive, is going to go from 2 to infinity, and the range is going to be from 3 to infinity. Now again, the domain here for the inverse would be 3 to infinity, so you have to switch them, and the range would be 2 to infinity. Now how do you find the inverse? Again, you just write it down. Okay, so I need to cut this radical, and I have a plus 3 on the outside. So to do this, let me make some room. The first step you should do is try to switch the x and the y. So x is equal to square root of y minus 2 and plus 3 on the side. Now you need to solve for y. So you subtract a 3, subtract a 3. So x minus 3 is equal to square root of y minus 2. To get rid of the radical, you square both sides. Now I don't want you to solve this, so keep it as it is. So it would be x minus 3 squared. Keep it as such. Now the square and the square root will cancel out, so it will be y minus 2. Again, you want to isolate the y, so you add 2, you add 2. So then what you have is x minus 3 squared plus 2 is equal to y. As you can see, those cancel out. Since this is an inverse, put in negative 1 to indicate that this is an inverse, and that would be it. So always when you do the inverse of a radical, you're going to get a quadratic. You see that? Now let's draw this on the side. So let me make this smaller and try to graph it. Now let's graph the radical function. So the endpoint is 2, 3, so 1, 2. 1, 2, 3, so that would be it. And since it's positive, it's going to be a shooting star. Now I'm going to use the red to draw the inverse. So to draw the inverse, let's look at the domain and range over here. So it's 3, 2. 3, 2. So that's the point I'm going to start at, 3, 2. So in red, so 1, 2, 3. And then 1, 2. So it would be somewhere over here, and since they're both pointing to plus infinity, it means it has to go up. So that would be your graph. You see that? It's gonna go up, so it looks like a parabola. You see that? You only care about the positive part of it. Okay, so you may need to watch this again, take your time, and if you have any questions, remember I'm available every Monday Thursday after school, and Wednesday morning. And is it a function? Yes.